Yay. So I see some people have started to put information in the chat about who they're with and what their title is and what have you. If people want to go ahead and do that, that'd be great. Okay, for everybody who's signing in, thanks. We're going to give it a few more minutes for more people to sign on. We had about 70 registrants, and so we need to give people a little bit of time to join us. Okay, we're not quite up to the full house we were expecting, but I think for timing purposes, we can go ahead and get started. I'll speak initially with just a little bit of background information about Refugee Housing Solutions, and that'll give people more time to sign on. So my name is Leslie Wilson, and I'm a member of the Refugee Housing Solutions team. Happy to be here with my colleagues Lynette and Lizzie and Isabel, and happy to welcome all of you here. I see some familiar names and faces of colleagues who work in the resettlement agency side of things. We've got a homeowner and some landlord folks on the call, which is really who this session is designed for, but we're happy to have our resettlement colleagues here to add texture and richness to the conversation. Hi, Alex, how are you? And just good to see the diversity of people who are going to join us. So we'll go ahead. I'm going to close the chat so I'm not distracted. And I will go ahead and get us started. So here you can see, I'll be presenting. Evie is actually not able to join us today. And so Lizzie will take the majority of the presentation. So thanks, Lizzie. And then Lynette is in the background because she's just going to be, not because, but in fact, she's going to be monitoring the chat, and she and Isabel will bring questions to the front as we need them. Isabella, if you could do the next slide. So here's today's agenda, fairly straightforward as we described it in the blurb. So I'll give you an overview of Refugee Housing Solutions and our main principle, what our main activities are. We'll talk about who are refugees and other newcomer tenants. Again, for the people on the call who are on the refugee resettlement side, on the service side, absolutely all the details of the definition. So this will be a little bit of a refresher or repetitive for you, but thanks. We'll talk a little bit about why we want housing providers, landlords, property managers, single homeowners, why we want them to rent to refugees, why it's a good value proposition, if you will. Lizzie will spend a fair amount of time reviewing some of the typical concerns that we've heard through the years and that we know from reading the popular press and what have you, that housing providers' concerns they might have. We're going to talk a little bit toward the end about ways to partner with us. And of course, these comments are also directed at housing providers, at landlords, at property managers. But for all of our resettlement agency colleagues who are on the call, clearly this will give you some, this isn't call is national in scope, and as is RHS's work, we work nationally, but there will be nuances that you can probably pick up on for ways that you can hold these kinds of conversations and forums locally. So that's the agenda. If we can go to the next slide, I will tell you a little bit about who we are. So we are quite a diverse team in terms of background and expertise. And we bring this all this expertise in affordable housing, hospitality. Many of us have worked in refugee resettlement for quite a while. Others are program design specialists, communications specialists, and strategy development specialists. So we all bring this together. And because of this, maybe not totally unique, but quite distinctive combination of backgrounds and skills and interests, we bring this to provide technical assistance, to work on capacity development activities for refugee resettlement staff and others, to design resources for all of our stakeholders, certainly for refugees, for landlords and other housing providers. We partner with a lot of different agencies to create new and different solutions. The United States has been welcoming refugees for decades and house them in very conventional ways with a lot of housing available and support. But in recent years, of course, there's an affordable housing crisis for everyone, for Americans as well as newcomers. So we're looking to work around the edges and in new directions to just see how much more dignified affordable housing we can help surface, and for all of us to use to house refugees and other newcomers. Okay, so again, here's a snapshot of what we do as a national team. We facilitate dialogue with a variety of stakeholders. Obviously, as I was just saying, we promote collaboration and partnerships. We lead alignment efforts. We work really hard with PRM and ORR, so the State Department and Health and Human Services, who provide a lot of support to newcomers to the country. We work with them to make sure everyone's efforts are aligned and heading generally in the same direction. We catalyze housing innovation. So when partners come to us and have a new idea for how we might house newcomers in new and different ways, using accessory dwelling units better, or revitalizing church properties in some new and different way so that refugees can be housed, we work on catalyzing those ideas. And then, of course, one of our main objectives is to just continue to expand the amount and quality of information that's available, and to share it more widely with as many people as are interested to learn about who refugees and newcomers are and how we have an opportunity to provide them with dignified, affordable housing. So here's a quick overview, very dense. I'm not going to read this slide, but it's just a description, and you'll receive a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. So you'll be able to see more specific examples of the different ways in which we provide training and technical assistance, which is our bread and butter, if you will, along with webinars and hosting working groups and communities of practice. As I say, those of you who have been to our website or on other forums like this, we produce a lot of resources for all different stakeholders. And as I mentioned, we work with different organizations and people to try to provide significant innovation. And then, as described, all of what we do is dependent completely on old school partnerships and new and different kinds of partnerships. So there's just a little bit of an overview of how we reach out and support people. Our key partners, as mentioned, of course, the U.S. Department of State, the Bureau for Refugees, Population and Migration, the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement, both are key, vital, strategic partners in all that we do. Increasingly, we're so delighted to be engaged more and more with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, because so many of the newcomers with whom we all work or to whom we rent properties are served by many of the programs that HUD provides. We work with state refugee coordinators. I think Jay Semple from Texas is on the call today, and we want to work more and more with SRCs, as they and the state refugee health coordinators and their teams are vital to all the work we do to welcome people. Obviously, we work with the 10 resettlement agencies, Church World Services one, the IRC, a lot of people on this call, Catholic Charities through the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, World Relief, and others who are tasked, if you will, by the State Department to welcome refugees as they come newly into the country. And that's a long-standing set of relationships that have maintained a robust and effective refugee resettlement program for decades now. A couple of projects that are managed by the IRC, Switchboard and CORE. CORE is the Cultural Orientation Resource Activity. Those are key partners of Refugee Housing Solutions. And then another project called Refugee Welcome Collective, which reaches out more for grassroots activities, is another one of our key partners. All right, so Lizzie, thanks for everyone for your patience and having let me talk through all the basics. And I'm going to turn it over to Lizzie to talk, as many of us know, the details of who refugees and other newcomers are. But for those who need to be reminded or want to know more, here we go.
Thanks, Leslie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lizzie Goddard. I am the Housing Innovation Officer here at RHS. And before we dig into this, I just wanted to share a little bit about my background and kind of why I might be contributing to some of this conversation. I've worked in refugee resettlement and housing in particular for quite a few years. And my time working with refugees and newcomers actually began internationally. So I've seen the refugee space when folks are first fleeing for safety, and how they're then connected to the resettlement process. So I worked in Greece for about 3 years with UNHCR. And then when I moved back to the US, I was a housing coordinator, like many of you that I see in the chat, with a local resettlement affiliate, and worked on forming housing partnerships with landlords, with property owners, management companies, like some of the other folks I see in the chat. So this is a conversation I'm really excited to be having, because it brings a lot of people together into one space, where we all need each other, right, to solve this problem. We need to connect the folks serving refugees and those that are, providing housing, and come together to find these solutions. And like Leslie said, we're going to kind of start with more of this baseline conversation that may be familiar to some people on the call, and it may be new information for others. So hang in there. But we will start with talking about who does RHS serve. So we can go to the next slide. So primarily, are we missing some? Oh, there we go. Just had the the animations, right? We primarily serve refugees, SIVs, which is special immigrant visa holders, and asylees. There's a lot of resources out there that we will share after that gets into the details of this. But from a high level perspective, what we mean by that are these are people that have fled due to a well-founded fear of persecution. And this is defined by a threat to life or physical freedom. Persons may also qualify for refugee status if they fear and can prove persecution on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, gender, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So these are people that are not safe to stay and that they have to flee their home. And likely they have fled to a third country for initial safety and then are connected into a resettlement program through UNHCR, which we'll get into the details of those steps. But refugees, SIVs, and asylees are a special immigration status. And it is a permanent status and it has a pathway to citizenship. In addition to refugees and kind of for simplicity's sake and additional content, we'll kind of refer to a lot of the questions about newcomers. We may say newcomers as a general term, so we don't have to list 8 different nuances here. But there are also humanitarian parolees and several other immigration statuses that the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement serves. These additional statuses, including a humanitarian parole, are associated with specific countries. They include Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. More recently, folks from the Ukraine and Afghanistan have also been able to have humanitarian parole status. And they have access to similar resources and benefits as refugees. It's just a slightly different category. And again, we're happy to share resources that get into the nuances of that. But I think the thing to understand about this is all of these are legal channels to being in the country, and very often someone achieves this status before they even arrive. Move on to the next. And then kind of the flip side of that, as we all know, there are also asylum seekers, right? And so that is someone who is seeking sanctuary and is in the process of claiming asylum, but is not yet legally recognized as a refugee and does not have that status. So we have systems in place to determine who qualifies for protection, and asylum seekers are awaiting a decision on an asylum claim. So they're going through that process. These individuals do not yet have permanent immigration status in the US, and they're going through that screening and interview processes. So here at RHS, because we partner so closely with the State Department and ORR, we're primarily serving refugees and the other newcomer groups that do already have that legal status. And to explain a little bit more about that, you know, as Leslie mentioned, the US has a longstanding history of participating in refugee resettlement. And RHS, in partnership with those federal entities, we work towards creating access to affordable housing on the ground with our local stakeholders, which some of whom are on this call. And we're also looking to how do we leverage the federal support that newcomers have access to and connect them with folks like, you know, local landlords or other community supports to help welcome them and settle them into their new communities. So newcomers receive federally funded assistance from the US Department of State and then also the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement. And I may use acronyms moving forward because that is a whole mouthful. Okay. And I'm going to give just a very brief overview of how does resettlement work. And again, this may feel very familiar to some of you, but I think it's really important for all of us to just remember and ground ourselves that this is a very detailed and very long process. When I worked in for a local affiliate here in Nashville, many of the households that I worked with had gone through years and years of screening before they were cleared to even travel to the United States. So I think, it's important for everyone to understand that this is an extremely detailed process. So for a household to even begin to work towards arriving in the United States, they first have to be referred by UNHCR, which is the International Refugee Council, and they have to be identified by them to be even considered for resettlement. So you can't, self-authorize to say, I think I'm a refugee. You have to be identified by UNHCR and kind of selected to move forward in that process. So I think back to my time in Greece, I worked in many UNHCR camps and other places where people had fled. There were field officers there working in those camps, identifying people, interviewing them, and starting to understand who might qualify to begin this process, who is vulnerable, who might fit within this process. It was not, hey, I'm going to get in this line and volunteer to be resettled. So it's a very selective process. Step two, the US government, if UNHCR says, hey, we're referring this person for resettlement, they are a refugee, we're going to provide detailed background information. The US government screens that person applying for refugee status. So they are screened by US government agencies. That includes biometric screening, it includes biographical screening, interviews, medical appointments. And again, over years, right? It's kind of the most thorough background check you could ever go through. Security databases are checked. There's a lot of extensive vetting that goes through. If someone kind of passes through all of those vetting processes and no red flags come about, that their refugee status is then approved. Again, that sounds fairly simple. Again, that process could take multiple years. Once that status is approved, the US State Department assigns the case to one of the 10 US nonprofits that partner to resettle refugees or a private sponsor. And we'll get to this in a moment of who are the 10 nonprofits. I think some of them are on this call. And then travel arrangements are made in tandem with the State Department and that receiving resettlement agency. And the refugees travel at their own cost to the US. So that agency, say it was Catholic Charities, just that's who I used to work for, is we would go to the airport and actually meet people there and pick them up from the moment they arrived in the United States, and we would help them get settled from the very first moment of their arrival. And that agency welcomes the refugee and their household and helps them integrate and become self-sufficient in their new community. Of the resettlement agencies that I just mentioned, if you are not familiar, or if you're not one of them, there are 10 national agencies who contract with the federal government to work with this US resettlement program. Of those 10 national organizations, I think I'm not sure what the updated number is. We know it's more than 340 offices around the country. I think that we have a map we could drop in at some point. We may do that. Oh, thanks, Lynette. Lynette just dropped a PDF. It's a really cool visualization of if you want to know, hey, is there any resettlement affiliates in my city or nearby? You can identify who might be close. Is it, an IRC, or is it, a Church World Services affiliate? And you can see the services that they provide. And if they're taking volunteers or looking for partners, right? So when a household is after that initial airport pickup, right, there's a whole host of supportive services that then kick in. So resettlement service providers have certain deliverables and wraparound supports that they're required to provide to ensure that newcomers and their families can thrive in their new communities. So we certainly do not just have people arrive in the country and then they're left without support. We have programs that are designed to really help people settle in and adapt to life in their new country and also recover from the trauma, right, of having to flee due to that fear of persecution. So this assistance includes, but is certainly not limited to various assistance. So financial assistance, there's a certain amount of direct cash assistance that's involved through those federal programs that can be used towards rental payments. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Job readiness and employment services. It's important to note that refugees are eligible to work from the day they arrive in the United States. So it's very straightforward. I think sometimes there is confusion around work eligibility, but they are able to work from day one. And then they typically will get their documents in the mail, depending the first several months of that work eligibility that, gives them that extra, hey, we can show you, but they also will have other documentation we'll speak about in a moment that shows that. Other supportive services may include financial counseling and budgeting, talking through, hey, if this is how much your rent is and this is how much you're making a month, should we make a plan on how much to set aside? Thinking through if there's multiple adults working in the home, how much they may need to make to afford a home, things like that. As well as interpretation services and English language instruction. So ESL is a required supportive service that's provided. So I know sometimes folks have concerns about how will I communicate with my tenants or how is that going to work? They will have case management provided that can offer interpretation. And additionally, they will have access to that English language learning. And then finally, they also are supported with cross-cultural orientation. I don't know how many of you guys have spent a significant amount of time in another country, but there are a lot of nuances, right? I didn't know in Greece for quite a while that I had to flip the switch on for my hot water to heat up before I could take a shower, right? So I just took cold showers for the first week I was there because I thought it was broken. And so it's things like that, right? Of, hey, here's how these appliances might work, or, something as simple as that for home maintenance, down to, explaining American culture and, meeting your neighbors and all of that, and all of the joy that can come from experiencing different cultures. Okay, and then now we're going to pivot to specifically talking about housing and housing provider, some of the surveying we've done, some kind of FAQs and concerns that have been raised, and really, really hone in on this housing piece and move away from kind of the general refugee resettlement process. And also, please feel free. I know this is a lot of content to move through. If you have questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat. We will have an FAQ section at the end, or Q&A section, but if you want to go ahead and put something in the chat, feel free to do that. All right. Here at RHS, we're extremely committed to our housing provider partners and understanding your perspective, right? We want to ensure that the solutions we put forward are mutually beneficial, right? And we truly see the benefits of renting to refugees and to newcomers. And we've taken the time, right, to gather data, to hear from you all. What's important to you? What are your concerns? And part of that was a survey that was conducted, I believe, in the spring of this year, about what are you guys seeking when you're screening tenants and looking for tenants. And I'm sure that this is, even though it's a small sample, I'm sure it translates to a broader, group of housing providers. you're looking for folks that are financially stable, right? You're running a business. You want to know that you can balance your books and you're going to receive those rental payments. You want to know that the rental property is taken care of. That's property that you own or manage, and you're responsible for keeping it well maintained. You want folks that can comply with lease terms and the property rules and that are good at communication. And the way that our rental system is set up in the US and most places is that there is a screening process to find cooperative tenants who can likely, financially be responsible for those rental payments. And so we'll get a bit more into kind of the FAQs, but I did just want to take a few minutes to speak to the strengths of renting with refugees and with newcomers. And I think really one of the strongest points of all of this is that when you are renting to a newcomer, particularly someone who is a new arrival, you're renting to a household that has a whole network of support behind them. I always say if I walked into a leasing office and leased up tomorrow, I could lose my job the next week and you would not have anyone else to call, right? There would be no case manager, no support system. I'm not bringing a team of people that are dedicated to seeing me succeed. The folks that we support and are connecting to housing are bringing that team of people that want to see them succeed. And so I think that's a huge benefit of renting to newcomers is that they have been extensively interviewed and vetted for safety and security. Some would say these could be some of the most vetted tenants you could ever rent to. And they're also receiving that support on cultural education and orientation about life in the US. Some of that even happens before they even arrive. And all of that continues once they are here in the country and are safely housed. And like I said, newcomers, they come with that case management, those wraparound services. And because they have gone through so much trauma, very often they're looking for stability and they want to stay housed. So we very often see folks that want to stay in those units. They want that stability and are eager to plug into the local workforce and start a new life. And so I think it's really important to also be transparent, right? So in part of our surveying and conversations, just qualitatively as well. And again, I think back to my work doing this on the ground several years ago and the conversations that I had with housing providers is that there are certain hesitations. And, part of what we're here to do at RHS is to hear you and to listen, and also to provide information around some of these concerns, and then some of the solutions and innovations we've seen around the country where we've seen really successful partnerships between resettlement agencies and landlords. So one, maybe the most popular question that can come up very often is, do refugees have documentation? And I think this goes back to what I spoke about at the beginning of the call and kind of touching on some of the statuses and the nuances, right, of newcomers. And going back to the refugees and the newcomers that RHS serves, as well as the 10 resettlement agencies, they have a legal status to be in the United States, and they do have documentation. So many will receive their Social Security card within the first several weeks, the first several months of their arrival. But from the moment they land in the US, they have an I-94, which is an arrival and departure record, which is a form of documentation, which is you can use during an application screening to verify identity. And it's evidence that they are here legally in the US and eligible to work. It's an identity document. So for any of you who may be connected to affordable housing or public housing authorities, anything like that, you'll see it on that long list of eligible documentation to verify identity. I-94s are on there. And also many refugees may have had to flee without their passport or maybe whatever ID that they had, but their case managers will help them obtain an ID card from the US state in which they reside. It may just depend on how long it takes to get there in the mail. We're dedicated to helping people get connected to permanent housing as soon as possible. So what we don't want to do is say, hey, we need you to hang out in a hotel for several months while we wait for your ID card, right? So what we do want to do is advocate and educate that I-94s are an identity document, and help our housing providers understand that that's an option during an application process. Another question and concern, right? Kind of an FAQ or something we can speak to is, how do I screen a refugee tenant if I can't run a background check? My colleague Evie is not on the call, but I always laugh because she always says it would be like trying to run a background check on a newborn baby. Because newcomers are brand new to the country, even if they did have their social security number in hand, nothing would come up, right? Because they have just started kind of their history in the country. And like I spoke to earlier, they have gone through likely months, if not years, of very intense vetting and interviews. And if that individual was deemed unsafe or a threat, they would not have been approved for resettlement or given refugee status. So consider these tenants some of the most vetted applicants you could screen just by having refugee status. And resettlement agencies offer additional support and credibility, because they're also offering that education on how does one safely maintain housing upon arrival in the US. And they're also offering education on local rental rules and tenant responsibilities, how to be a good neighbor, and all of those concerns of, is this going to be a risk to my property or to my other tenants? And I also do want to speak to that newcomer tenants have the same rights as citizen tenants and are protected by the Fair Housing Act. So just as we are asking them to abide by the tenant responsibilities, we also look to our housing providers to abide by the Fair Housing Act and their responsibilities to screen applicants fairly. And then speaking of screening, again, this can be one of the biggest barriers to refugees accessing housing, is again, similar to the lack of ability to run a background check. There's also going to be no credit history. Again, they could have arrived 2 days ago. They likely have not opened a credit card. And so we certainly understand a housing provider having concerns about, how do I make this decision on if this person is a financial risk? I run credit checks for my other, applicants, and that's how I make my decision. And so what we do is we often work with our housing providers to think through what are alternate ways to assess that financial stability, since refugees will not have a credit history. And part of the way that we've done that, and we've seen a lot of success across all of the different resettlement agencies, is that housing providers will forego a credit check. And if they have a letter of intent or a promissory note from the resettlement agency that outlines the financial and supportive services that the household is bringing to their leasing term. Which, if you think about it, if you're assessing the financial risk, that letter would tell you, okay, this person is guaranteed to pay X amount of rent, and they're also receiving support to connect to employment. So it will allow you to assess, is this a risk I'm willing to take? And is that risk actually greater than accepting this applicant with X, Y, or Z credit score? So we're not asking you to necessarily fully throw your screening process out the door, but just to think of alternate methods that allow newcomers to access housing equitably. And this is just a nice table. I won't spend too much time on it. Again, there's a lot of resources we will send afterwards that you could spend more time with. Again, a lot of the challenges are when someone is brand new to the country, if they're waiting on some of these initial documents. And so this table just shows if someone doesn't have their driver's license or ID yet, then that I-94 works for that. And then that either note or letter of intent from the agency can serve as that ability to assess financial kind of income or that risk as you're making that screening decision. And then we also get a lot of questions too of, we know you as housing providers, have a sense of responsibility for the tenants in your community, right? You may have tenants that have lived there for years and years, and you want to ensure that you are able to maintain a community that, is respectful of one another. And sometimes we will be asked, will refugees integrate into the wider tenant community? And again, I've spoken to this, but I think it's really important to remember that refugees receive cultural orientation and they're often so eager to settle into their new community. So that resettlement agency, as well as there's often additional volunteer resources, other community-based organizations, that want to welcome newcomers and help them settle into their life in the US. And again, help them understand, how to be a good neighbor, how to understand maybe the nuances of living in multifamily housing in the US. And if challenges arise, you have someone to call, right? So you have that case manager's number, you have the resettlement agency to call. You're not going to be left alone with those concerns if something does arise. And also too, I also love to just say that, even if it was not a refugee at your property, the cultural awareness and mutual respect is key to successful tenancies everywhere. Everyone likes to live a little bit differently. There's always challenges when you bring a whole group of people together in one apartment complex, or, someone wants to mow their lawn a different way, and that might rub me the wrong way, right? But so I think, in general, right, it takes a certain amount of respect and awareness of all of our neighbors, right? And so we just ask that housing providers encourage all residents to maintain a welcoming culture. And then I believe this is our last slide like this, but we often get asked as well, do refugees cause more damages than the typical tenant? Can I not evict a refugee if they're behind on rent? What happens if there's an issue? And again, I think it all comes back to this risk or perceived risk of, is this going to be bad for my business? Even if maybe I want to help, I want to be involved, I'm just nervous about the risk I'm going to absorb. And I think the answer to that is refugees may encounter housing instability, right? We're dedicated to being transparent. There's never a guarantee, right, that this tenancy will go 100% smoothly, but there's also never a guarantee that anyone who walks into your leasing office, that tenancy is going to go 100% smoothly. And so they may encounter challenges, but it's at a similar rate to citizens who may have the same resources, right? So if they're in, perhaps a lower income range, or, figuring out how to navigate an affordable housing challenge like many of us, but we do not see refugees necessarily defaulting on leases or causing damages at a much higher rate than the average tenant. But again, what I go back to is the difference is that you have a support network to reach out to if concerns do arise. And resettlement agencies are always encouraging their landlord partners to reach out. If something does happen, if rental assistance payment is missed, they want to know, how can we get back involved? What can we do? Was there an issue with that? Maybe they are having a hard time getting to the job they were first connected to. Maybe we need to think through a transportation plan. So they've got this whole team of folks around them helping them think through how can we keep you stably housed, and really dedicated to the partnership with the housing provider as well as to the family. And then lastly, if you've heard all of this, if you're still hanging on, thank you. I know it's a lot of content to move through. It's a lot of hearing my voice. But I want to speak to what are the opportunities if you've heard this, if you're a housing provider, or even if you're an RA housing coordinator wondering, how do I invite, other landlords to work with us? I think there's several opportunities, right? There's several different ways to engage in this work. And part of it depends on what type of housing provider you are. If you saw my comment, you may have seen me ask, hey, are you a direct owner? Are you a management company? And so if you depending on the size of your portfolio or how much direct control you have over those screening processes, one of the biggest ways that we can have an impact with our housing providers are really having that transparent conversation of, we're more than happy to provide education and technical assistance on everything I just spoke about, of what is an I-94, what is a letter of intent from an RA, right? How does that address how we're assessing risk? To see if housing providers might be willing to do an alternate screening process for newcomers to ensure that there's a smoother housing access process. So always more than happy to think through that together. Also, sometimes it's as simple as being willing to share your list of available properties to resettlement agencies. They very often have someone on their team that's tasked with housing coordination. If not, I know that there are case managers out there that are always eager to know if there is a house, an apartment, a unit, anything. Because there are new arrivals constantly coming in, right? So different sizes of families that have different housing needs. And so being able to understand who in the community is interested in partnering as a housing provider can be huge. Again, you can connect with us directly. We're more than happy to facilitate those direct connections with the local resettlement agencies if you're interested in being involved more. And then also too, if you're really passionate about this, maybe you've already been doing this work for a while, always helping spread some of the information we spoke about just now of, hey, there are ways to get past these screening challenges, or hey, refugees have gone through a lot of screening. There are really safe tenants to work with, to other landlords in the community who may have vacancies that they really want to fill. We also host a national housing working group monthly, which is really fantastic collaborative space with our federal partners, state partners, local resettlement agencies, some of our private partnerships as well, where we're really thinking through how do we create innovative solutions, and you can hear updates and share about perhaps if you have an innovative idea. We also have, kind of similar to the national group, some communities of practice that are regional, so a bit of a smaller, more contextual approach. And then we also host a lot of webinars and trainings similar to this one. If you want to do a deeper dive on specific parts of working with newcomers, or even we host a lot of housing training. If you're looking to brush up on Fair Housing 101, HUD programming, we're really here to build the capacity of housing systems, both for resettlement agencies, but for our housing provider partners as well. So essentially, if you want to partner, I'm sure that there is space for you. Reach out, and we would love to connect further. But just know that there are very likely in your community resettlement agencies looking for housing right now. So if you have available units and have heard this and are interested and want to connect, we would love to be a part of making sure that you guys have those introductions. And again, always happy to answer any further questions or concerns. but we all need one another, right, to find solutions. And we really see our housing provider partners as just really key partners in this work. And we want to hear your priorities and your concerns and address them. And with that, I know again it's a lot of content. You guys hung in there for 50 minutes straight, and I appreciate it. But I would love to just open it up for anyone. You're welcome to put anything in the chat, or come off of mute. I know we've got primarily, I think we've got a lot of resettlement partners. But if anyone who is more on the housing provider or landlord side, if you guys have any questions specific to any of the content or anything else, feel free to come off of mute, and then we can open it up to our RA partners as well.
Well, as our colleague Jesse Ireland likes to say, not everyone at once. So anyone who has any thoughts on what you've just heard or questions you'd like to ask, please do join us.
And I will just point out as well that there's several fantastic resources being dropped in the chat right now. We will also send it in our follow-up email. But there is a fact sheet, as well as there is a really great kind of landlord frequently asked questions page that was put together by HUD, the State Department, and the Office of Refugee Resettlement and our other federal partners, that speaks really clearly to a lot of what I just mentioned. So for housing providers, it can be really great to see it in a 2-page format. And for our resettlement partners, it's a really, really great resource to use as you're engaging owners and managers. Thanks, Jennifer.
Okay. So if there aren't questions, any comments, any suggestions, actually, for us, for Refugee Housing Solutions as a team, and for all our resettlement agency partners who are on the call, any thoughts from the landlords? I know there's just a few on the call, but about whether this was useful or how we could do it better in a whatever, what am I trying to think of, in a rehash or a reshow or a repeat. There you go. There's an easy word, repeat.
One thing that I think we would like is direct contacts for each resettlement agencies versus their general email contact that's on their websites. Because a lot of time those information ones don't even get to the people who actually handle the refugee services. So I've been beating down doors in numerous areas and I just don't get much response on email.
Sure.
So if you were able to get like a point of contact at each place, it would be very helpful for the landlords that want to engage.
That's great feedback, Christina. And what I can do is I'll, if you want to put your email in the chat, we can connect directly. And if there are certain areas or certain agencies you're connecting to, we can do a little bit of the behind the scenes work to get you those direct contacts, and make that happen. I think we've found that sometimes the second you make a list, it's out of date, right? There's a lot of turnover or things like that. But what we can offer at RHS is some of that kind of central point of contact and connection. So I will shoot you an email, but I think that's great feedback.
Yeah, I work successfully with numerous agencies in Tampa, Florida. I probably have about 35 families. I just started rolling out in Houston and I've only got about 4 families so far, but we have 624 doors in Houston. I've just started in Dallas, Arlington, and Fort Worth. So I've gotten a couple in Dallas. So I definitely am a landlord that's very open to it and we're familiar with the refugee process. So we're very open on this end.
It's great. I just made a note of all the communities you just mentioned, and we'll work on getting you direct contacts at each of the RAs in all of those communities.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Of course. I know half the battle, right, is figuring out who the right person to call is.
So Jennifer, would you like to join
For
us?
sure.
Yes, thanks, everyone. This is Jennifer Garrett from the Department of State, Bureau of Population, Migration, Refugees and Migration. And thanks for that question and some of the responses to that question regarding the resettlement agencies. I did put our rapsnet.org link in there that has a directory of agencies, but if you find that is, I mean, I think the last update we were able to make so far was in April, and we've already gone through our FY25 grant phase, so we're about to update that again for Q1. But if that is proving not to be a solid resource for you, your feedback is greatly appreciated. Feel free to give that to RHS and they'll just let us know. Over.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank
Alex?
you so much.
Oops, sorry. Alex?
Thank you so much for this really fascinating presentation. I was wondering, so I'm from Variant Solutions. We are collaborating with Refugee Housing Solutions on a number of fronts. And as they presented, they had already deployed a landlord motivation survey earlier this year. But we've also developed a second survey that addresses some other complementary pieces of information that we didn't necessarily capture in that first round. So if anyone on this call is a landlord and has 10 minutes to respond to that survey, it would be really, really appreciated. The results are going to be used by the resettlement agencies to understand, again, how to provide you with better services, how to communicate their services to you. So, and of course, if there's any RAs on here who have lists of landlords who would be willing to share it with their landlords, we would really, really appreciate that outreach. Of course, the more data points that we have, the more robust our findings are. And we can, the more we can learn and provide improved services to landlords and the communities that we're trying to serve. I just put the link to the survey in the chat and should redirect you to that survey. Let me know if you have any issues with it.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, and on that point, in terms of our RHS partnership with Variant Solutions, what, among other things that they're really looking to do is to smooth, if you will, direct communication between refugee tenants and landlords so that resettlement agencies staff don't have to always be in the middle of the conversation. And there's technology behind that, and I won't go into the details because I probably wouldn't get it right. But anyway, it's just an effort, a really, obviously state-of-the-art modern day effort to take out the middle person and have refugee tenants and landlords talking directly to each other, and even facilitating some documentation and what have you. And I'll leave it at that. But Alex, if you have if you want to drop a link to your website as well, or to the Pacto app into the chat, that might be of interest to some of the people on this call.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Yeah, and the idea is to give landlords and tenants more autonomy earlier on, but still stay connected to those resettlement agencies so that their support can be punctual if there's anything that requires their intervention. But from earlier on, they can develop those autonomous relationships, which is so important to sort of the longevity of that relationship. Thanks again, Leslie.
You bet.
And I threw the link to just our Pacto website, which explains what the app is in the chat. Yeah.
Thanks. All right. Anyone else for the good of the cause? Questions, comments, suggestions for the future? Going once. Okay, so here we are in an hour. We've got a couple more slides. Obviously, for everybody who's a resettlement service provider, an agency, you know how to submit a technical assistance request booking. It's on our website, which is refugeehousing.org. So that's another way for everybody on this call, landlords and housing staff alike. If you want to have a specific conversation on a specific topic, you can do that. And then there's another slide, again, just a panoply of resources. These are all on the website. You can download them all. The tenant toolkit is in 9 languages, and we're getting ready to add a 10th. The landlord toolkit speaks directly. It speaks both to small scale, own 1 or 2 property landlords, and to people who manage larger apartment complexes. And so again, a lot of great resources there. The most recent one is how to vet housing providers and their properties. So if you're a property owner and you want to look at the things we look at when we're trying to find, is this a safe, accommodating place for a newcomer to be housed, that's all in there. And then of course for refugee housing staff, there's lots of great information in there. And again, just an example. And then here's the key contact information. Lizzie, who led us through most of the afternoon, Lynette, who's one of our key senior technical assistance providers, and you can write to Lynette directly at lpearl@cwsglobal.org, or just go to TA or to the website. So that's all the information we have to share for today. And we thank you for joining us, and we will be in touch with follow-up. And if you have any questions, just reach out to any one of us. Much.
Thank you so much.